Hello and a very warm welcome. The biggest question at Davos, as it is across the world at the moment, is what to expect from Trump 2.0. And for this special edition of the news track, where we're broadcasting from the India Today studios at the World Economic Forum at Davos, I have three super sharp foreign policy minds. I want to begin by introducing Gideon Rachman, Chief Foreign Affairs Commentator for the Financial Times. Hello, welcome. Hi. Great to have you back.
Good to be here.
I have Ishaan Tharoor from the Washington Post, and I have Ravi Agrawal, who edits foreign policy. Thank you very much, all three of you, for joining us. I want to start by asking you, Ravi, about Trump coming in as president once again. What is it that frightens you the most?
Gosh, well, if you look at his agenda, I think the two things that scare me the most in the immediate term are tariffs and deportations. Both could be very destabilizing. Both could have impacts that affect not just the American economy, but the world itself. If you look at tariffs, to start with that, Trump has said he would impose anywhere from 25 to 40% tariffs on a range of countries, including allies and neighbors, maybe up to 200% on Chinese EVs. All of that could be immensely destabilizing for business. What strikes me as strange about it is that if you listen to the people who, in Trump land, who believe in tariffs, these are longer-term policies that make sense over time, if they make sense at all, in a trickle-down sense. But Trump is a short-term guy. He's not a long-term guy. So if there's any inflation, which tariffs cause, if there is market pressure, which tariffs cause, he might backtrack. So that'll be very interesting to see how that plays out in the first few weeks. And then deportations. This could be inhumane. It could be cruel. We don't know the extent to which he's going to lean into that. America has around about 11 million undocumented immigrants. Trump has claimed the numbers as high as 21 million. So the delta between what he might do and could do is extremely large. And the next few weeks will
Is it likely to be notional, just to show that he's flexing his muscles and sending some people across the border? Or do you think he could go the whole hog?
We don't know. I mean, that's the scary thing about Trump world, and that he can do anything. But you have to prepare for the worst. And this is, again, where the market might react in a very strong way, because A, it costs a lot of money to deport people, just in terms of the actual policing of it. But also, this is not good for the economy. If you think of 40% of undocumented workers are in the agricultural sector, so picking oranges, for example. Who's going to do that work? Who's going to do all the other types of work, whether it's construction or washing dishes that undocumented workers do? There will be trickle-up effects on all kinds of industries that could lead to an outcry from many of Trump's friends and allies as well.
Ishaan Tharoor, last time Trump came in, it was a bit of a surprise for him. It was a surprise for the rest of the world. It was a surprise for everyone at Davos. This time, everyone knows that he's back. He's far muscular, stronger, more certain, has a better team. What do you expect his most immediate action agenda to be?
Well, you're right that he comes in this time around with fewer surprises around him. His first term was a jolt, disrupted in various ways. Now he's almost conditioned the world to expect him. And we know that the first day he takes office, he's going to sign or draft dozens of executive orders. We'll get a glimpse of what his agenda will be when he does that. Those will include things like scrapping subsidies for electrical vehicles, perhaps some sort of signaling around the border and border policy, signaling his kind of culture war over diversity. But I think more broadly, we will see a Trump in his second term who is much more gloves off, who has many more loyalists in Congress, controls both chambers of Congress, and will be acting as if he has a much larger mandate than he may actually have.
Gideon Rachman, from the perspective of the rest of the world, what, according to you, is the greatest damage that Donald Trump can cause?
Well, I have to say, I sit in Europe, and there's a particular perspective here, if you're Britain or the European Union, which is that Trump has, and the people around Trump, have a pretty clear hostility to the EU. And there's a very uncomfortable sense that in addition to all the kind of stuff that Ravi's talking about, like tariffs, which affects everybody, there is an agenda to kind of, if you like, get the European Union. And if you look at the people who Trump has invited to his inauguration from Europe, they're the far right, essentially. Giorgia Meloni of Italy has been a slightly more centrist figure, but you have the Alternative for Deutschland, who many in Germany regard as a party that flirts with Nazism. You have people from the far right in France, and meanwhile in the UK, Elon Musk, who's obviously so close to Trump, is actually calling for the overthrow of the British government on X, and accusing them of being pedophiles and so on. So it's a very difficult and uncertain period. And if you take, say, Britain, for example, if we really are now facing a United States that's actively hostile to our government, that really calls into question the structure of 70 years of British foreign policy. We're deeply integrated with America on national security, on intelligence, on nuclear weapons. If America's now hostile to us, it's the same as with Canada. What do you do? I mean, it's a really fundamental question for the UK and for Europe.
So Donald Trump's been talking about taking over Greenland. He's talking about reworking the Panama Canal Accords. He's also talking about turning Canada into the 51st state of the United States. How much of this is rhetoric, bargaining and negotiation? And to what extent is he serious? And what can he really do, Ravi?
I mean, the Canada thing is not going to happen. I think that strikes me as definitely in the rhetoric and in the crazy rhetoric camp. But as with everything Trump says, there's always a kernel of resentment at the core of his ideas and whims. And with Canada, I think it's a broader sense that, we're being hard done by. We Americans have backstopped Canadian success, and, why shouldn't we just take over? Why can't we reap the benefits of what we're investing? Same feeling with Europe as well. And I think, there are limits to that kind of theory, because when it comes to sort of actually acting on some of these crazier proposals, imperialist proposals, I think Trump will find that the obstacles are simply too great. And these are not countries that are going to take it lying down. I mean, Canada.
What deals can he cut with, say, Greenland, Panama, or Canada if he can't take over? Which is this idea of new imperialism is hard to push through. But what can he really get done? And what is he aiming to get done?
So this is sort of the transactional theory of Trump, right? Where he could, in Panama's case, maybe get preferential rates for passing through the canal. In Greenland's case, it could be preferential access to the Arctic Circle. Now, all of that is hypothetical in that, there are other levers to pull to get those kinds of deals. I think that a lot of us have been thinking about Trump's transactionalism maybe in slightly the wrong way. I think this doesn't always work out well for the United States. There are many countries that look at Trump's transactionalism, and the first thing they think is, you know what, we can take advantage of that. So we know how to get to him. We know that, we're speaking to an Indian audience, so this is kind of like an Indian family business. The Trump world, the Trump White House, his plutocrats, his friends. So? Well, think of the role that Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump had in the first White House. Think of Masad Boulos, father-in-law of Tiffany Trump, who's now involved in the Middle East. Think of Charles Kushner, who's going to be ambassador to France. If you want access to Trump world now, you kind of know who to go through. You know the ins, you know the people to speak to. You know how to strike your own preferential deals. So it's not just one way. If you're Saudi Arabia, if you're India as well, the Ambanis, of course, are at the inauguration today. They're going to know how to figure out their own ins in this very transactional world. So if you have clout, if you have size, strength, or salience, you're in luck in a new transactional world. If you're small, if you're insignificant, good luck.
Tough. It's almost like the Darwinian idea of survival of the fittest comes back to the fore. If this was happening elsewhere, Gideon Rachman would lead to a huge pushback, saying this is a banana republic, they've gone crazy, this is crony capitalism. A lot of that seems to just be normalized now.
Well, that's an interesting question. I think people in their heads continue to say, I hope they continue to say, look, for the incoming president to issue a meme coin and pocket a few billion 2 days before. It's grotesque. It is corruption. But people are reluctant to say it because he's the power in the land. And the question is, how long will that silence last? Will it grow, actually? Will Trump be able to continue to intimidate people and so on? But I think that, picking up on what Ravi was saying, it's a very interesting question whether this is going to backfire for the United States, because what Trump is doing and the people around him are doing are making a huge bet on American power, that basically they're kind of irresistible. But will they find that actually the rest of the world organizes, or, for example, the Europeans who, Biden didn't follow a different strategy. He said America's not that strong anymore. We need allies. So they try to work with India and the European Union in a way to isolate China. I think Trump feels he can just pull people along because they have no option. Does the EU, for example, now take a warmer attitude to China? I think it's certainly possible. For example, on Chinese EVs, do they try to use China as a lever against the United States? Possible.
Ishaan, let's spend a moment talking about tariff and the extent to which you actually see the Trump team push through on their threats and their belligerence from 60% to 10%. There's a whole spectrum out there. What do you see Trump actually do, and could he also impact India because he's spoken of India being the tariff king, or is that just bargaining and negotiation?
Well, again, we'll see. As Ravi said, there's an extent to which people in the Trump world and Trump himself believe that tariffs are necessary to restore America to a different footing, to re-alter the kind of whole mechanics of the global economy so that U.S. manufacturing is once more king, to wean sort of vulnerabilities and reliance on China, to wean themselves off those vulnerabilities. But again, we live in a much more complicated moment, and there's no sense that tariffs in this year and the next years will do anything but harm the average American. And how much Trump is willing to sustain that cost, we don't know. We've heard Elon Musk say, oh yeah, there's going to be short-term pain, and we should be ready for it. Now, Trump did not win an overwhelming landslide election. He won by a couple million votes on very narrow margins, and won votes that that the Republicans may not win again. So their appetite for that pain, you should question. So we'll see in terms of what he wants to impose. He will probably target China in a particular way. He probably will have some kind of new spat with Mexico and China and Canada in terms of reconfiguring further deals regarding the current existing agreements. But of course, as Gideon has noted, he will have an axe to grind with Europe. But I suspect the blanket moves may not happen. I think there'll be more targeted bullying here and there.
You wanted to add something?
Yeah, I'm just interested actually from the folk who live in Washington, because it seems to me there's some ambiguity in Trump world about China policy. Look what he's saying about TikTok. Suddenly he's the guy who wants to make it, back on people's phones, and he's often expressed admiration for Xi Jinping. So whether there'll be a tension that emerges between Trump's transactionalism and his sense that, okay, he's going to sort of punch the Chinese, but in the end they're going to do a deal, and he likes Xi and he gets on with Xi, he's not interested really in the defense of Taiwan, and the China hawks who really do surround him, like Wells and Bridge Colby and all those people who are very serious about containing China. I think that's a really interesting thing to watch.
I think it definitely is an open question in terms of what is his approach going to be when it comes to the U.S.'s putative adversaries. We suspect that he will be much more conciliatory and soft with Russia. But we also know that he has floated internally a genuine desire to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and there are already channels being opened up with the Iranians. There is.
What's he most likely to win the Nobel Peace Prize for? Of all the conflicts. Well, no, but seriously, what's he most likely?
The great Arctic peace over Greenland with the American flag, and I generally don't know, but he does want to be seen as a deal maker.
I think he would see Ukraine and the Middle East as his two biggest shots, but it would require.
Can he get it done, you think?
What's it? I think there may be a ceasefire in Ukraine, but the question is on what terms and whether it's just a prelude to a restart of the fighting. And in the Middle East, it's possible there'll be Israeli-Saudi normalization, which is what the Biden administration will working towards anyway. But there are big obstacles there because I think the Saudis will insist on some kind of tangible process towards a two-state solution. There's no appetite for that in Israel. And the Saudis also want a security guarantee from the United States, which is not what the kind of America First crowd, or certainly one wing of it, would like to do, because they want to do less of that around the world.
He's serious about wanting to win a Nobel Peace Prize. Can he get it done in 4 years? And what is it most likely for, if at all? He also wants to go down as America's greatest president ever. Or he's convinced he already is that.
Look, I mean, an unknown committee of people makes this choice, and who knows what's on their mind. A lot of strange choices have been made over the years, so we laugh, but you never know. Look, I think more than that, the big contradiction to look out for in Trump world is On the one hand, over the last few years, one of the big animating debates in Washington has been among sort of the restrainers, the people who believe that the United States should pull back from arenas around the world, and the ones who believe in primacy. And in many senses, the restrainers have won out the argument in the last few years with the pullout from Afghanistan, with a general sense from Iraq onwards that primacy went too far. Now, Trump world is strange in that, in as much as one of its guiding principles is America first and restraint, it has many hawks in its sort of orbit, some of whom will get named to key positions in the next few weeks, some of whom believe in bombing Iran right away while it's weakened, some of whom believe in being tougher on China than even Trump might want to be. So how a lot of these contradictions get resolved, I think will end up speaking to some of these questions you're asking. But I think, on the Middle East more broadly, I see zero chance of a two-state solution or a broader Middle East peace. It is so off the table for the general Israeli public now, but also for Trump. I think the people Trump has already put in place, the ambassador he's named to Israel, Mike Huckabee, he is as far right on this issue, refuses to even acknowledge the West Bank and Gaza with those names. There's no chance that personnel, if personnel is policy, that they're going to try and advance land for the Palestinians. And then with Ukraine, finally, if we move towards a deal, I think much of it will have to do with the exhaustion of the last 4 years. In recent days, there is a little bit of talk from within Trump world of trying to actually appear tough on Russia in a way that we didn't hear 6-7 months ago. And I think some of that walking back of their previous stance is a belief that in any transaction, you need to appear big and strong first. So that'll be another interesting thing to see play out.
Let's spend some moments talking about what Donald Trump's presidency could mean for India and the Indian people, because there's immigration, legal and illegal. There's also tariff, and then there is the larger relationship between Delhi and DC. So Ishaan, what is it most likely to mean for the US-India equation?
Well, there could be friction when it comes to, as you said, tariffs. Of course, you have, in the weeks before inauguration, a huge debate within Trump world about H-1B visas, with a wing of the Trumpist faction, of Trump's people, really animated against it. It's also surfaced a whole rather nasty world of anti-Indian racism in the American right. And then you have others in Trump world, Elon Musk in particular, who are very much in favor of this program that has brought tens of thousands of Indians to the United States, and want to do more, to expand those channels, make it easier for Indians to get their green cards, etc. And that will be an attention to watch as an Indian, for any Indians who watch in the US. What is also important to recognize, and I'm sure these are discussions had on your network, is the growing influence of the Indian lobby in America. Trump has all sorts of contacts with various Indian American businessmen, and as do the Democrats as well. But that you'll see over the next few years a consolidation of that influence, and we'll see what kind of influence Indian Americans can have on policy that is quite divisive.
Most in the Indian government and in the BJP ecosystem would much rather have dealt with Trump than with Kamala Harris. So they're quite happy the fact that Donald Trump is coming to power. How do you see the relationship between Delhi and DC play out over the next 4 years? And what can India do to ensure that it gets the best hand that's possible, given all the changes that are underway at the moment?
So just to explain why that difference is key, I think New Delhi may have feared that a Democratic White House would have been more vocal about potential human rights issues in India, or democracy promotion in India. And India, of course, doesn't like hearing those things from the United States for good reasons. Trump, on the other hand, we don't imagine is going to care much about those issues. But if you look at the last time round, he focused on little things like Harley-Davidson bikes and the tariffs on those. So you can imagine that something big and flashy is going to be the thing that Trump's eyes kind of focus on. But I wouldn't I wouldn't see any of that as getting in the way of the larger trajectory. I mean, over the last maybe 5 or 6 American administrations now, there's a clear bipartisan agreement that the US-India relationship is on the right track and needs to continue as such. I don't think there are any chips in that, no matter who's in the White House. So there will be little disagreements here and there, but India increasingly just has so many touch points with the Trump administration on a variety of issues that I'm very confident they'll be able to sort out any differences.
Gideon Rachman, from your lens, how can India make the most of this situation? Because the confrontation between China and America is likely to get worse. There are some opportunities there for India. How should the Modi government be navigating these changes?
Well, I suspect they'll try and sort of do much of what they were doing before. So encourage, if America's trying to get their companies to divest from China, maybe get them to move to India, to just build up the tech relationship between India and the US, which was already going very well, to present India geopolitically as a counterbalance to China, and actually to get America to take Indian concerns, about Pakistan, about China very seriously, to build it essentially into a new kind of special relationship. I was saying the UK-US special relationship is in danger now. But I think that maybe the India-US special relationship still has a way to go, despite all these potential flashpoints.
So here's a leader who doesn't want to play sheriff to the world, doesn't want America to be the leading power, would much rather look within. Does that then, Ishaan, in your view, accelerate the trend towards ensuring that the world has adequate systems, whether these are financial systems, economic systems, that can keep the ball rolling regardless of the role the United States plays?
Fine, Trump may not want to play sheriff for the world, but he may want to play mafia boss for the world. The current position on the American right isn't one that is interested in these discussions in multilateral institutions, isn't interested in talking about what a multipolar world looks like. They may be more restrained, but they still value or sort of think about American primacy as a kind of essential principle. That, we are the world's superpower, we get to dictate these terms, and any geopolitical obstacles to that should be reckoned with. And I don't see any conversation within Trump world about how to think about the global South, how to think about sort of the international system at large.
Yeah, I think that mafia boss comparison, although it sounds like an insult, is actually quite a useful way of thinking about it, because I think that's why Trump respects Xi and Putin, because they've got powerful families, and they have territories, and you respect that. Whereas if you see weakness, well, that's just an invitation. If you have a bruise, you punch the guy's bruise, you don't say, can I help you? And that's why he picks on Canada or Denmark, because what are they going to do? They have no crew.
So one is the mafia boss syndrome, the other is the madman theory, right?
Yeah.
That he kind of pushes, just appears to be crazy in the hope that he can cut the best deal. But a lot of the academic research seems to be suggesting that the madman theory doesn't work in the real world.
Yeah, so this was, I think Nixon coined the term, and it doesn't always work. I think sometimes, when you present as crazy and people expect crazy, you have crazy outcomes. And there are lots of historical examples of this not working out, even with Trump. For example, when he thought that writing love letters to Kim Jong-un would work out in his favor, it didn't, and then he promised to sort of rain fire and fury over North Korea. So that kind of schizophrenic behavior is probably what we have on the menu for the next few years. But on the point about Trump as a mafia boss, I think that's a great way of thinking about it. Part of the problem is that if you look at the last 4 or 5 decades of the global order, what seemed to work for the world and was a rising tide that lifted all boats was more globalization, more free trade, international systems that worked, the WTO, systems and norms and rules that everyone could abide by and follow. And when the United States begins to take a leading role in not following those rules that it helped create, for example, on trade, that sends a message that we're entering an era of jungle law. Again, bigger players might survive, but if you're a smaller country, it doesn't look good for you.
And this was an era when small countries did well, because there were rules. And in fact, you saw the number of countries grow because there was a kind of framework that could protect them.
But if Trump follows the law of the jungle, Ishaan, then what's to stop Xi Jinping from saying, hey, this is the best opportunity I have for making a dash for the Taiwan Straits?
Why?
I mean, that's a good question. And the Taiwanese themselves are fearful that, even though Republicans are staunchly pro-Taiwan, Trump may bargain away Taiwan's security as part of his idea of a grand deal with the Chinese. And that was not a fear.
That's possible because that's blasphemous. You think it is?
Totally.
I mean, he said it before. He's threatened to not support Taiwan in the event of an invasion. Now, again, so much depends on the personnel, because much of what we know of many of the people who are entering his national security orbit in key roles, they believe the opposite. I mean, they really want to strengthen Taiwan.
Already. I mean, if you see,
That's true.
If you see Bridge Colby, he wrote a whole book about how the defense of Taiwan was critical. As he sees the prospect of a job in the Trump administration, what the boss is saying begins to dial that down and say, well, maybe because, the Taiwanese aren't defending themselves well.
So are you of the view that the reunification of China with Taiwan is now more likely in the next 4 years than it's been in the past?
I prefer to say conquest.
No, from Xi's perspective, reunification, but conquest otherwise?
I would call it a conquest too. I don't know if it's more likely, because the other side of this equation, and we know so little about the Chinese economy, they've usually acted from a place of strength. It's such a black box. I mean, if you look at some of the numbers, whether it's debt, whether it's lack of growth, whether it's the fact that their population has declined for a third straight year running, there are many reasons why things don't look great for them. And there are two theories on this, that when China's not doing well, it either lashes out in a bid to sort of keep the people happy, eat nationalism as it were, or that they bide their time. And who knows?
How does this impact India and China? Because this is a time when India and China are just trying to mend bridges after what's been happening for the last 4 years at the line of actual control. Will the US assert that India side with DC more openly? How does that impact the relationship between India and China over the next 4 years?
Look, as we were saying earlier, India is a bipartisan concern in the United States. There is a desire from all sides in Washington that India plays a more close strategic role alongside the US in the quote-unquote Indo-Pacific. But I think there's also an appreciation that India has its own existing way of doing things. It has its own kind of principles. And there's not much of a desire in Washington among serious people to challenge that. I would wonder, though, in the event that Trump does some kind of major diplomatic initiative with the Chinese, how that may compromise Indian interests, and whether Trump would be willing to compromise Indian interests in the event that he can score some major, in his mind, optical victory or triumph diplomatically with the Chinese. I think that's a more open question.
Do you think the prospects of a deal with China are more likely, or do you think the prospects of greater fragmentation are higher?
Both. I think we had a lot of Trump diplomatic effort with the Chinese in the first term. But that was a lot of sound and fury.
Incidentally, I mean, just on the question of a deal, I was talking to a British diplomat who'd worked, on US relations, and he said the thing about Trump is actually he's really quite a bad deal maker. So that their strategy was always to try to get the Prime Minister alone with Trump, because Trump had no interest in the detail. So his staff would fight really hard and be really tough. But once you had him alone with Trump, he didn't know the dossier, so he'd say, oh, yeah, all right, whatever. So that's the strategy. And I think Xi will be much better informed than Trump on the details.
There's an add-on to this. There's also the tyranny of the last briefer. So whoever the last person is who has Trump's ear can sort of convince him and win him over on a range of issues, which is why he's flip-flopped on so many things, whether it's TikTok, maybe now in Ukraine. So that's the other challenge. Whoever is
Speaking of briefers, let's spend some time talking about Trump and Elon Musk. Do they stay best friends for 4 years, or will they have a blowout? Who wants to go first?
Well, I think right now we're in a situation where, yes, you have Secretary of State Marco Rubio, but is Elon Musk the real Secretary of State? I think that's something that many in Washington are seeing him as. He's somebody who, what he thinks about the U.S. and the world has as much impact as actual American diplomats or the Secretary of State. But you're right. I think there may be a moment, and that may come soon, where Trump falls out with him.
You're betting on a falling out?
I'm betting on a falling out within the first 2 years. Yes.
You're betting on a falling out within the first 2 years. Ravi, do they stay best friends? Because Elon Musk hasn't said a bad thing about Xi Jinping. He's been able to, when there's someone more powerful than him, he's able to keep the equation going. Do they stay on the same side for 4 years, or do they have a nuclear explosion?
I mean, he's a businessman first and foremost. And so with China, of course, huge Tesla factory near Shanghai. So he has to make good with the Chinese always. Weirdly, this is also a point of leverage for the Chinese on him, and therefore on Trump potentially, which could end up being a point of friction if Trump ends up taking extreme actions on Beijing. But yeah, I'm with Ishaan here in that you have two men with immense egos who have...
Who has the bigger ego in your view?
Trump, probably, I would imagine. I don't know. Maybe it's Elon. It's a tough one.
I think there's an interesting, specifically India angle, which is I remember talking to people in the Biden administration who very badly wanted Musk to set up in India because as part of this rebalancing away from China, and were aghast when he cancelled the trip to India to go to China. Because
why do you think he did that?
Because he had more of a commitment to China, and it was more important to get, Tesla what it needed in China than to look at some notional...
So which side are you on? They stay friends or they have a blowout?
I don't know, because, you'd think, certainly in personality terms, of course there'll be a blowout because there's two big egos. But on the other hand, Musk is a proposition that Trump has never really had to deal with. He has such wealth, such concentrated power, that I wonder whether at some point even Trump has some anxiety about breaking with Musk.
Is this the way the US politics on the Republican side is likely to stay, with whoever is Trump's successor taking forward his agenda, or do you think a reversion to mean and more centralism is more likely? Ravi?
Well, it depends on when, first of all. If something happens to Trump and it's within the next 4 years, or if it's after an election, which the Republicans may win, may lose, a lot depends on the means through which they have to think about succession planning. Were a Trump surrogate or J.D. Vance to lose the next election, I think that could mean what you're describing as a reversion to the mean. But we mustn't forget that this party, we call it the Republican Party, but it really is Trump's party. Almost everyone who is left there has declared absolute fealty to Trump and Trumpism. Many of the people with the old conservative values have been driven out. And in fact, some of them may have serious actions against them in the coming weeks if Trump decides to go after.
I think
Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, people who've spoken out against him. I would bet on this absolute fealty continuing until there's either a loss or a massive, massive crisis.
Let's look at this in a global arc, because governments which seem to be left liberal, whether it's the government in Canada, seem to be in trouble. And even in Germany, the Chancellor is in trouble. The AfD is being backed by Elon Musk and probably even by Trump. So how do you see Trumpism impact global politics?
Wow, it's a huge question. But I think that definitely he legitimizes, or his success legitimizes, a new form of politics. And so a whole bunch of issues that you used to say, well, we won't go there, maybe people will go there. For example, if they go for mass deportation in America, then people in Europe will start saying, we should do that. And indeed, Alice Weidel, who Musk interviewed and said, she's really moderate, how can you call her far right? A couple of days later started talking about deporting not just illegal immigrants, but people who are now German citizens on the grounds that they were somehow a bad fit with Germany. So I think you'll get a huge rightward cultural shift on issues like immigration, human rights, all of those things. They're no longer in fashion.
This trend towards a rightward shift in politics, Ishaan, has been on for quite a while, and there was a sense amongst the commentators that there'd be a pushback or a return to centrism. Is the trend towards rightward shift in global politics getting accentuated on account of Trump's success in the US?
I think what we're seeing is a kind of exhaustion of a certain strain of center-left politics in the West. That perhaps has reached a kind of endpoint. You look at the Biden era. The Biden administration is the legacy of the Clinton era and the Obama era, and the Blair era. And the fact that you see in the U.S. Elements in the J.D. Vance element of the Trumpism is this populist appeal, and I think the Democrats are going to have to at some point come up with their own form of populism. And that's
So do they go further left, or do they try and push towards the center and redefine what the center?
I mean, I think they'll be operating in reaction to whatever happens out of Trump. Well, there is a major inherent contradiction in Trumpism between its kind of gestures towards populism and then the fact that at the end of the day, it is serving the quote-unquote oligarchic interests of the rich and billionaires and these tech titans. And at some point, that contradiction is going to be exposed. And the question is how the Democrats align against that.
Lastly, Donald Trump's been talking about wanting to end the war between Russia and Ukraine. Ravi Agrawal, is he likely to get that done? One of his big things was I want a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. He managed to get that done. Who got it done is a different matter, but they managed to get that done. Will there be one in the first 100 days between Russia and Ukraine?
So, first of all, again, I mean, this happened under the Biden administration in the Middle East, and who knows if it holds. Right. So, a word of caution on the ceasefire in the Middle East. I think with Ukraine, a lot will depend in the first couple of weeks on whether Trump is trying to help the Ukrainians negotiate from a position of strength, which would be new, or he reverts to some of his campaign rhetoric of saying he can get it done quickly. Because anything that happens very quickly is going to favor Russia. Anything that is given a little bit more time and hopefully allowing the Ukrainians to negotiate from a position of strength will give them a better outcome. The other part of this is who protects what is left of Ukraine and how much of that responsibility falls to NATO, Europe, to the United States. That will be a big challenge. Now, Trump, of course, has said he wouldn't. So a lot will depend on, again, the people in his orbit who are able to convince him to do otherwise or not. Or if Trump ends up believing that part of his legacy should be defeating Putin, as it were. We just don't know.
But does he care about that? Because Putin and he, in some ways, might be similar. Do you think that is hugely disadvantageous to Zelensky and Ukraine's cause?
Yeah, I mean, I think he admires Putin. I wouldn't be surprised. I think he'd like a big summit with Putin, and but equally, I don't think he wants a debacle on his watch. So they don't want the fall of Kiev like the fall of Kabul. So to that extent, they may try to get a Ukraine that can survive. But I have a question as to whether Russia's that interested in talking. You know, we all assume that if Trump whistles...
What's your reading of Putin's mind?
I think that they think they're winning, despite the huge losses. That Ukraine is running short of men, and that they can. This is probably the last big military package of aid from America's been and gone, and if they keep going, that they can win. So why would they settle for less?
And the other thing for Trump is that this is also a European issue. It's a European problem. And any kind of discussion about security guarantees for Ukraine, about protecting Kiev, will essentially see Trump and Republicans hammering away the Europeans to do more, to pay more. And that'll exert a tremendous amount of strain on politics there.
And also, incidentally, the new far-right forces in Europe are very pro-Russian. So within Europe, you're going to have a group of people who are beginning to taking power in Austria, will be big forces in France, Germany, saying, put troops in to protect Ukraine. You're crazy. We're not going to do that.
Let's, before we end, spend a moment talking about Modi and Donald Trump, because both these are very charismatic leaders. They kind of seem from the outside like each other. How could that, and to what extent do you think that could help India and US do better than they would have done otherwise, given the organizational structures at play?
Look, leader to leader, chemistry and ties matter. They've now met each other many times. They share a likeness for big audiences, big summits, the showbiz of it, the media of it. So in some senses, they're almost kindred spirits on that front. Look, I think it matters in that having deciphered what the two of them like in terms of outcomes from summits, from public perception, it may open room for their teams to actually hammer out details on the nitty-gritty. Again, having acknowledged on this panel that there's huge bipartisan agreement in DC that this relationship should be furthered, should be advanced, that defense ties, tech ties, all of those increase and are enhanced. Those details, I can't imagine Trump himself really caring about the nitty-gritty, but opening the way by having a friendly summit. The optics help at the lower levels.
There's some talk, Ishaan, about Donald Trump coming to India. There's a Quad summit that's likely, a big howdy Trump kind of rally. How do you see the dynamic between Narendra Modi and Donald Trump play out over the next 4 years?
I think there's all reasons to believe that it'll be a very warm and cuddly relationship. They'll have moments of kind of spectacle together, whether it's in India or in the US. You'll have rallies in maybe not Texas, but another state where maybe a swing state where there's a big Indian population in the US, because Trump will care about that kind of support from Modi. I think that it doesn't really matter who's in power in the US. The India-US relationship is on a very strong trajectory, and there's very little that can happen that could wobble it.
What's your worst nightmare? What's keeping you awake at night?
I guess that this all goes horribly wrong. Trump miscalculates. He makes some sort of terrible deal with the Russians, but then the Russians go back to war, so you have more war in Europe, but this time without an American defense guarantee, so they begin to threaten NATO. Oh, and meanwhile Xi Jinping takes Taiwan, and you'll kind of have global destruction and more war.
What's your worst nightmare?
I think the two things, the prospect of mass deportations are going, and if he actually enacts them, it's going to be hideously inhumane, probably lead to all sorts of violations, and be very disruptive to the American economy. And then secondly is the question of a day after scenario in Gaza. I don't think there's anybody in Trump world who particularly cares, and so we're going to see a real kind of toxic legacy left there that Washington will not spend much time trying to fix.
What's your worst nightmare, which you think may actually be within the realm of possibilities?
So everything we've discussed is in the realm of possibilities. I think the thing that worries me even more than all of that is, when rhetoric takes over, when it's really nasty, and then you forget about simple military-to-military communications, diplomatic communications. I think I worry the most about something silly happening, in
what
high seas.
Define silly?
Let's say a Chinese vessel and an American vessel deciding to be adventurous against each other, and then shots are fired, and then that leads to escalations which lead to more escalations. I worry the most about the de-escalatory mechanisms being weakened so much that something serious breaks out, and even potentially something nuclear happens because we've weakened diplomacy as much as we have.
Well, there'll be more people reading and listening to all of you because of all the changes.
They won't. We're the legacy media.
Exactly.
They're listening to podcasters and jury.
Exactly.
Interesting. No, but at least there'll be more sensible people.
We'd rather not.
We'd much rather not be listened to at all, you're saying.
No, we want to be listened to, but not for those reasons.
Okay, great. So thank you so much for joining us. I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for taking our time. Thank you.
Rahul.
Thank you very much. Thank you.